It arrived in the mailbox sometime in October, and if you were 12 years old and into radio control, it was better than Christmas morning. Nearly 300 pages, newsprint cover, engines, airframes, transmitters, servos, products from 150 manufacturers, every one of them described in the kind of dense, specific language that assumed you already knew what you were doing, or desperately wanted to. You didn't read it once. You read it in sections over weeks, dog-eared the pages, made lists in the margins of things you might save up for by spring. It wasn't a shopping catalog. It was a map of a world you wanted to live in. That catalog came from a company called Tower Hobbies, out of Champaign, Illinois. A company that one young engineering student built from $800 in a dorm room into the largest radio control mail order retailer in America. A company that invented the toll-free hobby order line, put the first IBM mainframe in an RC warehouse, and launched one of the first e-commerce websites in the entire hobby industry. In 1995, when most people still weren't sure what the internet was for. TowerHobbies.com still exists today. The logo is familiar. The name is right there at the top of the page. But the company behind it is Horizon Hobby. The warehouse is Horizon Hobbies. The staff are Horizon Hobby employees. Tower Hobbies, the original, the one that mailed you that catalog, dissolved in a Delaware bankruptcy court in 2018, taking 332 jobs in Champaign with it. How does the company that taught an industry how to reach its customers end up being swallowed by a competitor that was born the same year, in the same city, for $18 million and change? That's the story. In 1971, Bruce Holchek was a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, working toward his MBA and spending whatever free time he had flying radio-controlled aircraft. He was not wealthy. He was not connected. What he had was a specific frustration that anyone who flew RC in those years understood immediately. Getting your hands on quality parts and equipment meant either knowing the right local hobby shop, if your town was lucky enough to have one, or waiting weeks for back-order shipments from suppliers who treated mail-order customers as an afterthought. Holchek believed there was a better way. He had $800 in personal savings and a clear idea. Build a mail-order company that would treat the RC hobbyist as its primary customer, stock products from every major manufacturer, and ship fast. He was living in Illinois Tower student housing when he purchased his first small inventory and began placing classified advertisements in hobby publications. He named the company after the building he was sitting in, Tower Hobbies. His younger brother Mark, still in high school at the time, became his first partner. Orders came in through the mail. Mark packed and shipped boxes from the basement of the family home. Bruce handled the buying, the advertising, and the customer correspondence. It was not a glamorous operation. It was barely an operation at all, but the orders kept coming. What Holchek understood, at 23 years old, was something that the established hobby distribution industry had not yet fully grasped. The RC hobbyist was not a casual consumer. He was a committed enthusiast who spent serious money on his equipment, studied catalogs the way other people studied technical manuals, and would return to a supplier again and again if that supplier respected his time and his intelligence. Holchek's early advertising copy was dense and direct. Product descriptions, part numbers, prices, no padding. The catalog assumed the reader knew what a glow plug was. It assumed the reader had already decided he was serious. That assumption alone was enough to build loyalty. By 1972, Tower Hobbies was advertising in American Aircraft Modeler, one of the country's leading hobby publications, and offering a free catalog by mail. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and Tower would send you the whole world by return post. The response was immediate. Hobbyists across the country, many of them in towns where the nearest RC-stocked hobby shop was 50 miles away, recognized what they were looking at, a direct line to equipment they had been struggling to find. The growth was not accidental. Holchek reinvested constantly, in inventory, in advertising, in the catalog itself. When Mark finished his own degree at Illinois in 1976 and sold his share of the company back to Bruce, Tower Hobbies was already running on its own momentum. By that point, Bruce had married Jerry, who became a central figure in the company's day-to-day operations, and the business had moved out of the family basement into its first dedicated space. In 1975, annual sales crossed $1 million for the first time. Holchek used the money to move into a proper building. Then he kept going. The hobby industry took notice. Tower was not the only mail-order RC company in America, but it was becoming the most talked about one. Not because of slick marketing, but because of something simpler. It shipped fast. It had what you ordered, and when you called with a question, someone who actually knew about RC equipment picked up the phone. In a category where customer service was historically indifferent, that was a competitive advantage that compounded every year. By 1978, Tower Hobbies' annual revenue had reached $4.8 million. It was, by any credible measure, the largest radio control mail-order company in the United States. Bruce Holchek was 30 years old. He had said from the beginning that he wanted to build the largest and finest hobby mail-order company in the world. By the end of the decade, the first part of that sentence was already true. For a long time, it was enough, more than enough. By 1980, Tower Hobbies had outgrown every space it had ever occupied. The company moved into a newly built 42,000 square foot office and warehouse complex at Interstate Research Park in Champaign. A facility designed from the ground up for the volume tower was now processing. The parking lot filled before sunrise. Inside, the warehouse ran 3 shifts. The catalog had grown to 294 pages. That catalog deserves a moment. For the generation of RC hobbyists who grew up in the late 1970s and 1980s, the Tower Hobbies catalog was not a piece of direct mail. It was a publication. It arrived in the fall, and if you were serious about the hobby, you set aside time for it the way other people set aside time for a book they had been waiting for. The pages were dense, product after product, engine after engine, radio system after radio system, each listed with part numbers and specifications, written in the kind of technical shorthand that rewarded the reader who already understood the vocabulary. There were no lifestyle photographs, no models posing with aircraft they had never flown. Just equipment, described honestly, priced competitively, available now. Men kept their catalogs for years. They annotated them. They circled items in pen, crossed them off when they finally ordered, came back to pages they had bookmarked the previous winter. A hobby shop owner in Ohio later recalled that customers would walk in with a dog-eared Tower catalog tucked under their arm and ask if he could match the price on something they had already decided to buy. The catalog was the authority. If Tower stocked it and priced it that way, that was the market. What made this possible was infrastructure that Holchek had built deliberately and ahead of its time. Tower Hobbies was the first mail-order company in the radio control industry to install toll-free 1 to 800 watts lines for ordering and customer service, at a moment when most companies still required customers to place collect calls or write letters. The phone lines were staffed by people who flew RC. You could call and ask whether a particular engine was compatible with a particular airframe and get an answer from someone who had an opinion worth hearing. That was not standard practice in mail-order retail in 1978. That was a revolution in miniature. Holchek also put an IBM mainframe computer into the Tower warehouse at a time when most companies in the hobby industry were still running inventory on paper ledgers. The system tracked stock levels in real time, processed orders the day they arrived, and generated shipping confirmations that customers received before most competitors had even picked up the envelope. By the early 1980s, Tower was processing more than 650 orders every single day. The warehouse floor moved with the particular controlled urgency of an operation that had figured out its own rhythm. Pickers moving through shelving systems they knew by feel, packers working stations they had occupied for years, the loading dock cycling through UPS and parcel post runs with the precision of a shift change at a manufacturing plant. The product line reflected the full breadth of the RC hobby at its peak. Engines from OS, Super Tiger and Webra, radio systems from Futaba, Airtronics, and JR, airframes from SIG, Goldberg, and Great Plains, cars, boats, helicopters, and then Tower's own house brand products, developed in-house and sold at prices that undercut the competition without cutting corners on quality. The Tower Trainer 40 became the aircraft that a generation of American RC pilots learned to fly on, a stable, forgiving high-wing trainer that the catalog described in plain language and sold at a price that made the decision easy. Thousands of men flew their first solo on a Tower Trainer 40. Thousands more crashed their first one and ordered a replacement kit the same week. The community that Tower Hobbies served was scattered across the country. Suburban flyers in Ohio and Texas, farmers in Iowa who flew over their own fields on weekends, retirees in Florida who had been in the hobby since the balsa and tissue era and had graduated to glow engines and proportional radio systems. What connected them was the catalog. It arrived at the same time every year. It told you what was new, what had been discontinued, what the current best value in a 4-channel radio system was. In a world before internet forums and YouTube reviews, it was the closest thing the RC community had to a shared reference point. By the mid-1980s, Tower Hobbies was stocking products from more than 150 manufacturers and shipping to customers in more than 50 countries. The warehouse at Research Park had become one of the largest single-site hobby distribution operations in the world. None of them knew the factory had already begun dying. The orders were still coming in, but somewhere in the accounting department, a conversation had been started, quietly, between two men who had been college friends, about what it might mean to put their companies together. Bruce Holchek and Don Anderson had known each other since their sophomore year at the University of Illinois, when Anderson lived across the hall from Holchek in the dormitory. They shared golf, model airplanes, and the particular obsession of men who had found a hobby they could not stop thinking about. Anderson remembered the two of them flying a radio-controlled aircraft near the assembly hall on campus and crashing it into Mount Hope Cemetery. They were hooked, Anderson later said. Both of them. After graduation, Anderson went to work at General Motors' Pontiac division in Michigan, while Holchek stayed in Champaign to start Tower Hobbies. But Anderson watched what his college friend was building from a distance, and within a few years, he came back to Champaign to start his own company, Great Plains Model Distributors, a wholesale operation that worked with manufacturers and supplied hobby shops with RC aircraft kits and accessories. The two companies were complementary on paper. Tower sold direct to hobbyists. Great Plains sold to the trade. In practice, the relationship was more complicated. Hobby shops resented Tower for going around them directly to their customers. When they discovered that Great Plains was also based in Champaign, and that its founder was Holchek's college friend, some of them grew suspicious of the whole arrangement. The tension was real, but the business was good. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Tower Hobbies and Great Plains Model Distributors both expanded, both profitable, both anchored in the same mid-Illinois city that was quietly becoming one of the most important addresses in American hobby manufacturing. Then, in 1984, a man named Clint Atkins entered the picture. Atkins approached Anderson about combining forces, merging Great Plains with Tower Hobbies into a single parent company that could dominate both the retail and wholesale sides of the RC hobby market simultaneously. The logic was straightforward. Tower had the customers and the catalog infrastructure. Great Plains had the manufacturer relationships and the trade distribution network. Together, under one roof, they would be the largest hobby company in America by almost any measure. Anderson agreed. Holchek agreed. In 1985, Hobbico was formed, a new corporate entity combining Tower Hobbies and Great Plains Model Distributors under Clint Atkins' leadership. Bruce Holchek, the man who had built Tower from $800 in a dorm room into the industry's dominant mail-order retailer, transitioned out of the day-to-day leadership role. The company he had named after the building where he bought his first inventory now belonged to a larger organization with different priorities and a different center of gravity. It was, by any reasonable accounting, a logical business decision. The combined company was stronger on paper, the synergies were real, and Holchek was not forced out. The merger was a transaction he agreed to, and he remained connected to the business for a period afterward. But something shifted in 1985 that is difficult to quantify and impossible to dismiss. The founder left, and with him went the specific personality that had made Tower Hobbies what it was. A company built on one man's conviction that RC hobbyists deserved better service than they were getting became a division of a corporation built on a different set of calculations entirely. The irony of 1985 is almost too pointed to state plainly, but it must be stated. In the same year that Hobbico was formed in Champaign, Illinois, another hobby company was founded in the same city. Its name was Horizon Hobby. It was started by a different group of entrepreneurs, with a different strategy, in the same town, in the same year. Two hobby empires born simultaneously, a few miles apart. One would eventually buy the other, but not in the direction anyone in 1985 would have predicted. For the next decade, Tower Hobbies continued to thrive under the Hobbico umbrella. The catalog kept coming, the warehouse kept shipping, Hobbico expanded aggressively, acquiring brands, adding product lines, growing its footprint in both retail and distribution. In 1995, Tower Hobbies launched Tower Hobbies.com, one of the first e-commerce websites in the entire hobby industry. The timing looked visionary. A company that had pioneered the toll-free order line was now pioneering online retail. If you had been watching from the outside, you would have said that Tower Hobbies was ahead of the curve again. But the curve was bending faster than anyone inside the building fully appreciated. Amazon launched in 1994. eBay launched in 1995, the same year Tower put up its website. The big box retailers, Walmart, Target, Hobby Lobby, were expanding their hobby sections and using their purchasing scale to undercut specialty pricing that Tower had spent 20 years building. The catalog model, which had been Tower's greatest competitive advantage for 2 decades, was beginning to show its age. A printed catalog is fixed the moment it goes to press. Prices change, stock runs out. A website can update in real time, but only if the company behind it is willing to invest in the infrastructure to make that happen. And Hobbico, now managing multiple brands across multiple categories, with growing debt obligations, was spreading its attention in every direction at once. The warning signs were there, written plainly in the numbers, if anyone had been willing to read them that way, but Hobbico was still growing, and companies that are still growing rarely stop to ask what they might be building toward. They called the expansion a strategy. It was not a strategy. It was momentum. And momentum, when it finally meets resistance, does not slow down gradually. It stops. In November 2005, Hobbico completed a transition that its leadership described as a milestone. The company became 100% employee-owned through an employee stock ownership plan. Every worker at the Champaign facility now held a stake in the company they worked for. The ESOP was presented as a statement of confidence in the workforce, in the brand portfolio, in the future. Men and women who had spent careers packing boxes, managing inventory, writing catalog copy, and answering phones on the Tower Hobbies customer service line now had retirement accounts whose value was tied directly to the health of the company they showed up to every morning. It was, in theory, exactly the kind of arrangement that aligned the interests of workers and management. In practice, it meant that when the company began to fail, the people who could least afford to absorb the loss were the ones most exposed to it. The acquisitions continued through the 2000s with a logic that made sense in isolation and compounded into catastrophe in aggregate. In May 2007, Hobbico acquired Revell Monogram, the iconic plastic model kit brand that had been a cornerstone of American hobby culture since the post-war era. In January 2010, Hobbico added Estes Industries, the Colorado-based model rocket company that had put solid fuel rockets into the hands of American children for half a century. In 2012 came Axial RC, Arma, and Durango, brands targeting the growing radio control car market. Also in 2012, Hobbico acquired Revell's German operation and launched Hobbico Europe, extending its reach across the Atlantic. Each acquisition brought revenue, each acquisition brought debt, each acquisition brought complexity, new supplier relationships to manage, new product categories to staff, new warehouse requirements to absorb. The corporate structure that had started as 2 complementary companies in Champaign, Illinois, had become a sprawling multi-brand conglomerate with obligations in multiple countries and a balance sheet that required everything to keep working simultaneously. Meanwhile, the retail environment that Tower Hobbies had been built to serve was being systematically dismantled by forces that no catalog could outrun. Amazon Prime launched in 2005, free 2-day shipping at scale across a product selection that dwarfed anything Tower Hobbies could stock. The consumer expectation that Prime created was not negotiable. Once a hobbyist knew he could order an OS engine on a Tuesday and have it Thursday with no shipping charge, the Tower catalog's order by mail model felt like a different century. Tower's website existed, and it worked. But it was competing against a company whose entire architecture was built around fulfillment, speed, and price matching at a scale that Tower Hobbies could not replicate without rebuilding itself from the ground up. The big box migration accelerated in parallel. Hobby Lobby expanded its RC and model sections through the 2000s, offering hobbyists the ability to walk in, handle product, and take it home the same day. Walmart stocked entry-level RC vehicles at prices that undercut the hobby specialty market. The network of independent hobby shops that had formed Tower's retail ecosystem, shops that recommended Tower to customers for items they did not stock. Shops whose owners had relationships with Tower's sales staff going back to the 1980s began closing in significant numbers. Each closed shop was a customer touchpoint that disappeared and was not replaced. Inside the Hobbico warehouse on Research Road, the pressure was visible in the everyday details that workers noticed before management acknowledged them. Over time, that had been routine became irregular, then rare. Product lines that sold slowly were discontinued without replacement. Positions that opened when someone retired were left unfilled. The catalog, still produced, still mailed, still the symbolic heart of what Tower Hobbies represented, began to shrink. Not dramatically, not all at once, but year by year, a few pages thinner, a few product categories consolidated, a few manufacturer relationships quietly ended. By 2016, Hobbico's annual revenue had reached approximately $175 million, a number that looked substantial until you set it against the debt load the company was carrying and the margin pressure it was absorbing from every direction simultaneously. Suppliers, many of them Asian manufacturers who had extended credit terms to Hobbico through years of growth, began tightening their requirements. Some demanded payment in advance. Others reduced their shipment volumes until outstanding balances were cleared. The supply chain that Tower Hobbies had spent decades building on relationships and reliability was showing cracks that purchase orders could not paper over. The ESOP valuation, which workers checked with the particular anxiety of people whose retirement security was tied to a single number, began to move in the wrong direction, slowly at first. The kind of decline that accountants describe as a correction and managers describe as temporary, then faster. In the year before the bankruptcy filing, employees would learn that the value of their ESOP accounts had declined by more than 80%. The United States Department of Labor opened an investigation into how the plan had been valued and managed. Men and women who had built their retirement expectations around those accounts sat with that number and tried to figure out what came next. What came next was not a recovery plan. What came next was a bankruptcy attorney. By the end of 2017, the only question left was when, not if. The morning of January 10th, 2018 was a Wednesday. It was winter in Champaign, Illinois. The flat, gray, windswept kind of winter that the central Illinois prairie does without apology. Workers arrived at the facility on Research Road the way they always did, through the same parking lot, through the same doors, to the same stations they had occupied for years. Some of them had been there for a decade, some for 2. A few had started at Tower Hobbies before the Hobbico merger, back when Bruce Holcheck still walked the floor. They did not learn what was happening from a meeting. There was no all-hands gathering, no executives standing at the front of a room with difficult news prepared in advance. They learned the way most people learn bad news in the modern era, through a screen. An internal communication went out. Hobbico Inc. had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware, filed simultaneously under the same case number, Estes Cox Corp., Axial RC Inc., Great Plains Model Manufacturing, Revell Inc., Tower Hobbies Inc., and several others. Every brand, every subsidiary, everything at once on a Wednesday morning in January. The filing listed between 200 and 999 creditors. Assets were estimated between $10 million and $50 million. Liabilities were estimated between $100 million and $500 million. The gap between those two numbers was the distance between what the company owned and what it owed, and it was not a gap that a restructuring plan was going to close. Futaba alone was listed as being owed $2 million. Supplier after supplier appeared in the creditor schedule, names that Tower Hobbies customers would have recognized from decades of catalog pages. 332 people worked at the Champaign facility when the filing was made. Many of them had structured their financial lives around the ESOP, the retirement accounts that had declined more than 80% in value, and were now, with the bankruptcy filing, effectively frozen pending the outcome of court proceedings. The Department of Labor investigation into how those accounts had been managed was still open. For the workers sitting at their stations on Research Road that January morning, the bankruptcy notice was not an abstraction. It was the moment they understood that the retirement they had been building toward was gone. The Chapter 11 process moved with the particular cold efficiency of commercial bankruptcy. The court approved bidding procedures. An auction was scheduled. The assets of Hobbico, its brands, its inventory, its customer databases, its warehouse infrastructure, its intellectual property, were packaged and offered to the market. Horizon Hobby, the company that had been founded in Champaign in the same year as Hobbico, that had spent 3 decades growing in the same city, that had watched the same catalog arrive in the same mailboxes that its own customers used, Horizon Hobby submitted a bid. It was the only bid received. On April 6, 2018, the bankruptcy court approved the sale of Hobbico's radio control assets to Horizon Hobby for $18.8 million. The deal included Tower Hobbies, its name, its website, its customer database, its brand identity. It included Axial, Aorma, and the other RC brands Hobbico had assembled through a decade of acquisitions. What it did not include was Great Plains Model Manufacturing's intellectual property, which was carved out of the transaction. The brand that Don Anderson had built, the RC aircraft kits that had stocked hobby shops across America for 40 years, was not part of what survived. Every Hobbico employee was required to apply for a position at Horizon Hobby, not transferred, not retained, required to apply as if for a new job at a company that had just purchased the organization they had worked for. Some received offers, many did not. Local news in Champaign-Urbana captured fragments of what that transition looked like on the ground. Rick Burris, who had worked in model technology at the facility, had already left before the acquisition went through. Russell Daly, a former employee, declined the temporary position Horizon offered him. Others took what was available: jobs in distribution, jobs in retail, jobs that paid less than what they had earned and offered nothing resembling the retirement security they had been building for years. In June 2018, before the summer was over, Hobbico converted its bankruptcy from Chapter 11 to Chapter 7. Reorganization was no longer the goal. The goal now was liquidation, selling whatever remained to satisfy whatever creditors could be satisfied. The legal entity that had operated Tower Hobbies, Great Plains, Estes, Revel, and the rest of the Hobbico portfolio was being dissolved. And then there was the ghost, Tower Hobbies. Com stayed online. The logo remained. The familiar layout, the product categories organized the way Tower customers had navigated them for years. It was all still there. But when a customer placed an order, the confirmation email came from Horizon Hobbies servers. When the package arrived, the return address was Horizon Hobbies warehouse. When a customer called with a question, the person who answered worked for Horizon Hobby. The customer database, the names and addresses and purchase histories of every person who had ever ordered from Tower Hobbies, built over 47 years of catalog mailings and phone orders and early e-commerce transactions, had been transferred to a competitor as a line item in a bankruptcy asset sale for $18.8 million total, with no other bidders in the room. The name survived. The catalog did not. And in the hobby world, for the generation that had grown up dog-earing its pages, those two things were not the same. The 1978-1979 Tower Hobbies catalog, 294 pages, newsprint cover, dense columns of part numbers and engine specifications, and radio system comparisons, sells on eBay today for $15 to $40, depending on condition. The people buying it are not looking for products to order. Everything in it is discontinued, superseded, or no longer manufactured. They are buying it because it is the physical record of something that existed and no longer does. They are buying it the way people buy old baseball programs or factory photographs, not for the information, but for the proof. The building at 2904 Research Road in Champaign, Illinois still stands. Horizon Hobby operates out of it. The parking lot fills in the morning and empties in the evening the way it always did. From the outside, very little has changed. The address is the same. The function, hobby distribution, is the same. What is different is invisible from the street. The 332 people who worked there when the bankruptcy was filed do not all work there anymore. Many of them never found comparable employment in Champaign-Urbana. The area's manufacturing and distribution economy did not absorb them cleanly. Men and women in their 50s with decades of specialized knowledge about RC products and hobby retail logistics found that the market for that specific knowledge had narrowed to a single employer in their city, and that employer had already decided how many of them it needed. The ESOP accounts, the retirement savings that workers had been told represented their ownership stake in the company they had built, were adjudicated through the bankruptcy proceedings. The Department of Labor investigation into how those accounts had been valued in the years before the collapse remained open for a period after the filing, for the workers who had structured their financial futures around those numbers. The resolution of the bankruptcy offered nothing resembling what they had been promised when the employee ownership plan was presented to them as a milestone. What Tower Hobbies invented, it is worth saying plainly, did not disappear. The toll-free order line became the industry standard within years of Tower introducing it. The in-house computer inventory system was replicated by every serious mail order operation that followed. The e-commerce website that Tower launched in 1995, one of the first in the hobby industry, pointed directly toward the model that eventually replaced it. Amazon did not invent direct-to-consumer retail. Tower Hobbies helped invent it in a 42,000-square-foot warehouse in central Illinois, 20 years before Amazon became a household name. What Amazon did was execute the same idea at a scale, and with a logistics infrastructure that no specialty retailer, however well run, could match. Tower Hobbies taught an industry how to reach its customers directly. Then a larger industry learned the same lesson and rendered the teacher unnecessary. That is not a comfortable irony. It is an accurate one. Tower Hobbies. Com carries more than 50,000 products today. The selection is larger than anything Bruce Holcheck could have stocked in 1980. The prices are competitive. The shipping is reliable. By the metrics that an e-commerce analyst would apply, it functions well. What it does not have, what it cannot have, because the thing that would give it that is gone, is the specific authority that came from being the place. The catalog was authoritative not because it was comprehensive, but because it was curated by people who cared about the hobby the way the customers cared about it. That curatorial intelligence, accumulated over decades, was not an asset that transferred in the bankruptcy sale. It belonged to the people who built it, and most of those people are no longer there. Somewhere in the RC community forums, in threads that go back 15 and 20 years, older hobbyists still refer to Tower Hobbies in the past tense, even when discussing the current website. They make the distinction without being asked to. They know the difference between the name and the thing the name used to mean. That distinction does not appear in any balance sheet or bankruptcy filing. It does not have a dollar value. But it is real. And the people who feel it completely. Think of a man in his early 60s, somewhere in Ohio or Indiana or rural Pennsylvania, opening his mailbox on a gray November afternoon. There is no catalog inside. There has not been a catalog inside for years now. He does not stand there long. He knows what is and isn't coming. But for just a moment, in the particular way that physical memory works, he feels the absence of something he used to look forward to. Not the products, not the prices. The feeling of opening something that assumed he was serious, that spoke to him in the language of a community he belonged to, that arrived every year like proof that the hobby and the people in it were still out there, still building, still flying, still real. He closes the mailbox, he goes inside, he opens a browser tab. It is not the same thing. He knows it is not the same thing. And that gap, small, private, never going to be filled, is what Tower Hobbies finally left behind.